distinguished guests, we're now heading towards a very interesting Fireside conversation, which is a segment that provides an opportunity to engage in a reflective dialogue, one that allows ideas to unfold, perspectives to be compared, and insights that we can examine as well. Steering this conversation, we have Mr. Dipta Shah. I'd like to request all of you to please put your hands together and welcome him onto the stage, the founder of 54i Ventures. His strategic insight and entrepreneurial leadership will help him in making sure that this conversation goes smoothly as well. Very happy to have him. And joining him, we have Mr. David Sislen, World Bank Division Director for Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Please put your hands together and welcome him. Someone who brings global experience in development economics and policy implementation, and he definitely offers a valuable lens through which we can examine Nepal's current economic trajectory as well as the future possibilities. Without any further delay, I request Mr. Shah to please start the conversation.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dipta Shah, and it's an honor and a privilege to be in such outstanding company. I'd like to start the conversation by thanking Mr. Kailash Siraya, Mr. Anup Kafle, Mr. Maheshwar, and the entire team at Kantipur Media Group for organizing this interaction. And in doing so, for continuing to champion the flow of public discourse on a range of consequential topics. I'd also like to thank Mr. David Sislen, who's the World Bank Group Country Director for Nepal, the Maldives, and Sri Lanka, for taking time out of his busy schedule to join us here for this fireside chat. Let's get started. Nepal stands at a rare inflection point. The political upheaval of 2025, when a generation of young Nepalis took to the streets, demanding accountability and opportunity, produced something this country hasn't seen in a very long time: a single-party majority government with a clear mandate. The new government has already signaled, primarily through its Ministry of Finance, that the private sector is the engine of growth. And with private investment driving 70 to 75% of Nepal's GDP, this isn't just rhetoric, it's arithmetic. However, the structural constraints are real. Policy unpredictability, a largely closed capital account, and a persistent gap between budget allocations and capital expenditure are areas that require urgent attention. The World Bank Group, Nepal's largest development partner, arrives at this juncture with a fresh 7-year country partnership framework and a toolkit spanning policy reform, advisory services, equity, lending, guarantees, and political risk insurance, essentially an entire arsenal of customizable instruments that few, if any, institution in the world can match. At the heart of this framework lies private sector-led development, private capital mobilization, and job creation. David oversees a World Bank portfolio of nearly $5 billion across Nepal, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives, and has been central to shaping what the group's engagement here looks like for the next decade. David, welcome.
Thanks, Dipta.
So I'd like to get the conversation started, David, with a little bit of a focus on jobs and private sector-led growth. So as you know, Nepal's young population, roughly about 500,000 new entrants into the labor force every year, and chronic outmigration, makes job creation arguably the country's most urgent development challenge. Can you please explain to our audience the World Bank Group's focus on job creation and the overall strategy to boost private sector-led development and growth in our country?
Thanks a lot, Dipta. I'm humbled to be here and a little nervous because I'm in a room full of people who know this economy better than I ever will. So I'm here with a lot of humility, frankly, and really excited to talk about this. And I couldn't be, I think starting with the jobs issue is really the right one. So globally, in the next 10 years, we're going to have about 1.2 billion new entrants into the job market. And if the rate of job creation stays like it is, 300 million of them will be without a job. And who knows what the AI transformation is going to mean to those numbers. In Nepal, I don't need to tell you, 2,000 people a day, young people, leave the country. To put that in a little bit of perspective, because the 2,000 number always is hard to put your finger on, in the 21 months that I've lived in Nepal, 1.2 million Nepalis have left the country to seek work abroad. In the 4 years of my assignment here, and hopefully I'll stretch it to 5 if my bosses let me, but in the 4 years of my assignment, basically the population equivalent of Kathmandu will leave the country to search for work abroad. It's a staggering number. And so the jobs agenda globally is the bank's North Star, and the jobs agenda for Nepal is our North Star in the country partnership framework that you mentioned that we took to the board a few months ago, about a year ago. Let me just say briefly that I think that the three, sort of our framework for thinking about jobs that our president has very clearly laid out, have a sort of a three-pronged approach, thinking about the infrastructure, the policies, and the finance. And I think that we would all agree that on all three of those, Nepal has made major progress, but has massive work to do. So in the infrastructure space, we know last year the government executed about 59%, less than 60% of its capital budget, and the execution of the capital budget over the last decade has only gone down. Roads, the desperate need for civil aviation reform, urban infrastructure, et cetera, it is a critical challenge in the country. In terms of policies, I think, as was mentioned by Anup and you, the new administration really does seem to be laying out a series of policy reforms that are very targeted at getting private investment going. Things like some liberalization of the capital account that you mentioned, meaning that you can repatriate profits, addressing some of the quite Byzantine tax issues in the country. There are a few countries in the world where tax regulations can change today and then be applied retroactively to your earnings from last year or 5 years ago. Issues like that, I think, are really central to the Nepali job challenge. And just finally, on finance, it is quite ironic that we have a banking sector with 120% of GDP in the banking sector, and yet capital seems to be constrained. So that's partially because of the reliance on collateral-based short-term lending instruments, but it's also because, and this is something, Dipta, you know very well, that early upstream venture money, angel money, is a missing piece of the puzzle. So really looking at those three buckets, I think, is the biggest challenge, or is the most clear way to think about the jobs challenge in Nepal.
Thank you, David. I think that's an excellent framework to kind of dissect the topic at hand. But I want to double-click a little bit more on the jobs agenda a little bit. Not all jobs are created equal, right? So if you just kind of take a microscope and dissect the jobs agenda here, in which sectors do you see the highest priority opportunities for private sector-led growth? Or stated differently, how does the World Bank's strategy translate, in practical terms, into the kinds of jobs that will help retain Nepali talent at home?
Yeah, Dipta, it is the question, right? And I think that one of the things that I've been most personally kind of moved or inspired or animated by has been a really clear vision of the new economic authorities of the new administration to lay out a vision for where the jobs are going to come from. And I think that, I used to work a lot on cities. And when you work in cities, you are very careful that you're doing urban planning for the city of the future and not the city of today, and surely not the city of the past. And I think that in some respects, without criticizing anyone, in Nepal there had been a little bit too much of thinking about the country of my childhood or the country that my parents grew up in rather than the country of the future. There is a bit of a cognitive dissonance. A lot of us old guys, and I consider myself an old guy now, we think that the country that we live in is the country of our childhood. And actually, Nepal has radically changed in the last 30 years. It is a much more urban country. Extreme poverty has been effectively eliminated. Lots of poor people and lots of vulnerable people, but extreme poverty no longer exists. So the idea that Nepal will become an agricultural powerhouse, given its infrastructure, its geography, and its fixed exchange rate with the Indian rupee, is probably not realistic. The time that it would take to build a strong manufacturing sector, and there will always be some. There will be some agriculture, some agribusiness. The future of Nepal is in the services sector. It is in the IT space, probably, and it is in tourism. And coming to sort of terms with that and separating what are our job policies from what are our poverty and social net, safety net policies, I think is very important. So, you know, we talk in the World Bank a lot about getting to 7% growth. We'll probably talk about that more today. And whether you say a $100 billion economy, which is what FNCCC is saying, or 7% growth, it is the same. It is really the same number. And I think the bottom line with Nepal is that growth is too anemic. Nepal has grown on average at 4.2% over the last decade, and the difference or the last 20 years, the difference between 4.2% and 6.5% is the difference between Nepal at $1,400 per GDP per capita and Vietnam at around 4 times that. So getting to growth quickly, and this is where I make the point with the services sector, and here I'll end, it takes 10 years to build an irrigation scheme in Nepal. The so-called national pride projects, everyone's heard of the national pride projects that are designated by the Planning Commission, at the current rate of implementation will take 40 years to implement. So getting to 7% today or tomorrow or next year is much more important than getting to 7% 3 or 4 or 5 years from now. And that is really why I think we think the services sector is a place where dynamism happens and that we can really see some of that growth very quickly. And I think that mentality of figuring out where the job's going to come from is critical to public policy making.
Thank you, David. And again, I really like the way you position the conversation because it's really a retrospective on what is the art of the possible in the past, but really a focus on what is the art of the possible in the future. And you touched upon my favorite topic. So if you permit me, I'd like to talk a little bit about the composition of the services, right? That could be of relevance to Nepal's growth in the future. Can you say a little bit about how the World Bank Group is looking at digital services, digitalization, the digital ecosystem, et cetera? Maybe a few comments about what the view is from the donor community, which you stand at the top of.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say one thing, I'm really proud. While I formally represent only the World Bank side of the World Bank Group, I'm here, I think, without permission from my IFC colleagues to speak on behalf of both the World Bank and the IFC because we really are every day trying to work more and more together. The solutions for Nepal, for a country like Nepal, particularly in the digital space, are not going to come from the public sector and they're not going to come from the private sector. They're going to come from a combination of action in both places. So let me just talk about 2 things just as I think as examples. So we've recently taken to our board and the cabinet endorsed a very important operation to support the government's own, this is on the public sector side, to support the government's own digitalization of public services. Incredible, I think, ambition from the new administration. They talk about it all the time. It's sprinkled throughout the 100-point plan, and lots of work to do. I don't need to tell the people in this room that waiting 2 years for a driver's license is not normal anymore in 2026. Even in my own city of Washington, D.C., you do it in an hour, right? So these are the kinds of things where we really think the application, the delivery of public services, where the digitization can make an enormous difference. On the private side, our colleagues at IFC have done this incredible program with WorldLink, $29 million program. Many of you have heard about it. I had a chance to go visit the data center that's being built here in Kathmandu just last week. A really amazing story of bringing together a little bit of public energy, but a lot of private sector money, risk sharing, and a vision for addressing both the digital public services side that we're working on, plus the really unlocking the private investment that we see in the space. Look, let's remember, Anu made some good points, and we can be a little bit negative on the Nepali economy, but last year Nepal exported $800 million, nearly $1 billion in IT services. There is stuff going on. Some of us had a chance to be in Harvard and meet all these young, incredibly energetic, youthful, digital entrepreneurs. The opportunities are enormous in Nepal. Let me just end with a final point on this because I'm droning on, but let me just make a final point. Kathmandu, where we are sitting, has something that almost no other city in the continent has. and that is that in 25 years, it is going to be livable in the summer. It has a climatic advantage, and if we think about where the foreign investment for the IT industry and digital space is going to be, this is the place where I would bet on, because if we can get some of the issues fixed, because much of the places that are right now hubs of digital innovation may be unlivable 25 years from now. So again, a little bit thinking about the country of the future and where the jobs are going to be, I think, is part of that story.
Thank you, David. I think that's an excellent framing of what sort of jobs to look forward to and how we can come about with those jobs. Shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk about the mechanics of how the World Bank Group actually works on the policy side. So as you mentioned earlier, the new government has signaled intent to repeal restrictive laws, reform tax administration, and introduce a one-stop investment service. How does the WBG intend to work with the new administration to sequence quickly enough to actually move investor confidence?
Yeah, I mean, so we are really, so I think a centerpiece of our strategy that I really want to highlight is that we are working, while I'm very honored to be here, we are working incredibly closely with our colleagues at the Asian Development Bank. And the reason that I flag that is because we really think that as the two largest supporters of Nepal from the development partner community and the two multilaterals, we are much better joining forces than competing against each other. And I put that in the context of our joint work on policy reform that we are engaged in deeply with the government. And let me talk about a few of the things that we're working on, many things, but let me talk about a couple of the areas where we think critical reform is needed. So the first is around bumping a little bit over to the public side, is on getting capital expenditure working. It is a crisis in the country, as I mentioned before. And what seem to be very pedestrian issues, like getting permission to cut down a tree, or the ability to properly acquire land or rights of way, being able to move an electric pole, have reached near crisis levels. So interestingly enough, a critical element of getting the growth jump started in Nepal is about getting the government functioning on the public sector side to get capital investment going. Some of those things will go beyond policy reform. So when we think about some of the large hydropower assets the country has the potential to develop, those will really need creative financing and public-private partnerships. Maybe we'll talk more about that. But the first piece of the first bucket of challenges that we're working on deeply is that side, the public expenditure piece. I think a second is what I think you were leading to, which is, broadly speaking, the business environment. I don't need to tell you that Nepal has one of the lowest levels of foreign direct investment in the world. 1/20th, 5% of the emerging market average over the last 10 years. Frankly, almost zero. And so getting investment, both domestic from many of the people in this room, but also foreign direct investment is really critical. And some of the many issues that are things that we mentioned, that I already mentioned that we're working on, are things like the tax regime, things like double taxation treaties with potential investors, things like being able, as I mentioned already, to repatriate your profit. This is a country with a largely closed capital account, something that is probably, that's understandable given the history, but that may really require some time, some kind of reforms and the time to think, and now is very much the time to think about. So the business environment, the capital budget, and then some of those sectoral interventions. We talked about digital. Nepal is in desperate need of a data protection act. It does not currently have one. It is in desperate need of a cybersecurity policy. And so some of the sectoral policies in areas like tourism, digital, et cetera, are also on the table.
Thank you for that, David. So David, I'm going to push you a little bit outside your comfort zone, so you'll have to excuse me for this. But on a topic that's very dear to my heart and has been at the core of my professional development for the last 17 years. So the IFC, the World Bank's private sector-facing arm, has committed to deploying up to $750 million in Nepal across MSMEs, hospitality, energy, transport, digital infrastructure. Can you walk us through how IFC sequences its engagement from upstream advisory all the way through to investment and third-party capital mobilization? Just give the audience a sense of We talked a little bit about the enabling environment, but what can the institution now do in terms of transactions and actual capital mobilization? How does it work?
No, thanks a lot, Dipta. I mean, I'll speak briefly. I touched on the WorldLink example, which I'll probably talk a little bit more about, but let me just be very brief on it. So I think the first message is that the IFC does, so for those that don't know, World Bank Group, 5 entities as part of the World Bank Group, the World Bank, IDA, IBRD, that's where I sit, and we lend to the public sector and work with the public sector, and IFC, the International Finance Corporation, works with the private sector. I think I would say very briefly. First, the IFC is not in the business of just parachuting in and cherry picking investments. I think they really have a vision to deeply understand the sectors that they're working, identify gaps, work upstream, as you mentioned, to provide the kind of technical assistance and advisory work that's needed, and then, critically important, to try to mobilize as much private capital as possible rather than retaining everything on their own balance sheet. I think that is one of the big interventions or evolutions of the last 10 years, is that really the idea of mobilization is central to what the IFC is doing, and frankly, to what the World Bank is trying to do as well in big infrastructure. So that's the first point. I think, as I mentioned, WorldLink is a great example, because there you have the IFC was able to grab a little bit of subsidized public money from the World Bank. It was able to, called the private sector window of IDA, it was able to bring a partial credit guarantee instrument and partner with Standard Chartered to get this $29 million engagement up and running. So that idea of not just working in a silo, trying to do deals, but actually bring together the financial sector, the domestic financial sector. Some of the issues that they are continuing to work on are things like rupee-denominated debt instruments, more de-risking or risk-sharing instruments, et cetera. I would just sort of end by saying, with a bit of a repetition of what I said before, that this idea that either the public sector or the private sector in isolation is going to help Nepal get to 7% growth is probably an antiquated one. And really what we see across the range of issues that we're talking about, whether it's the digital space, whether it's hydropower, whether it's getting the dysfunctional public transport system of Kathmandu fixed, is going to require, or the air quality challenge that is probably one of the most growth-limiting issues in this city that we all live in, is going to require a combination of public and private action. And the more that we are working across our own internal boundaries, I think the better we serve the Nepali people.
Thank you, David. And again, here, I think there's an interesting concept that you bring to the fore here. And I think it's worth delving into this a little bit more, because the concept of blended capital is what you're fundamentally speaking to. Is that right?
Blended capital, public-private partnerships, bring monies together from different places and bring interesting financial innovation like guarantees is, I think really the future of it's really the future of the development business.
Thank you, David. So building on the capital mobilization conversation, right? Let's move to infrastructure, because without infrastructure, nothing really works. Nepal's infrastructure deficit in roads, transmission lines, cross-border connectivity remains one of the most binding constraints on private investment. Yet the fiscal space to close this gap through public spending alone simply doesn't exist. Addressing this gap remains key to realizing Nepal's growth prospects. What can be done to mobilize more private capital and leverage the private sector in building infrastructure?
Yeah, finally something that I feel comfortable talking about. My macroeconomist colleagues get very nervous when I talk about macroeconomics. But look, again, trying to be brief, because I'm watching the time and I really want to make sure we have a chance to engage. But I think, let's talk a little bit about the hydropower space, for example, because I think that is one in which the new administration has laid out a very ambitious agenda, in which there's incredible opportunity, and frankly, in which the clock is ticking, because the water resources that we are so fortunate to have in this country in the Himalayas will not be there forever, and every day that we delay is a day lost. And I think that's a perfect example of places where bringing the public and private together, both for the capital side of things, but also because of the managerial acumen that the private sector brings to the table, is going to be central if we want to crack the nut of hydropower development. The government Broadly speaking, there are 3 mega projects that are being thought of in the hydropower space. Most of you know them: Upper Arun, Dudkoshi, and Budhigandaki. Those 3 put together, before the inflation that has sort of gripped the world and that risks affecting us, those 3 put together are somewhere around the $8 to $9 billion worth of investment. Let's see what they end up final cost being. I don't think there's any reasonable way to think about cobbling together $9 billion of public money to invest in these highly risky, complex, but potentially transformational investments. So thinking about models of public and private, again, getting more out of the private sector than just the financing, but thinking about how bringing a private operator can help de-risk the actual delivery of the investment is critical. I'm going to make a very quick reference to an operation that the World Bank has just taken to our board a few months ago in Bhutan. So a country a little different, but not so different from Nepal. I'm not bringing examples from Nigeria. This is from Bhutan in the region. But the Dorjilung hydropower operation is a perfect example of this, where you bring an international private sponsor, some subsidized grant money from the World Bank, and what's called IBRD enclave lending, so taking money from the more developed countries bucket of the World Bank to bring together a public-private solution for transformational investment. So I think these are the kinds of examples that in Nepal we need to really think much more about, even if thinking about the old way of doing things as fully public investments is more comfortable and in our comfort zone. So I don't see a way that Nepal is going to live up to its aspirations of these 35,000 or 15,000, depending on which number you look at, megawatts of hydropower, without taking a much more aggressive approach to public-private partnerships.
Thank you, David. That's a very comprehensive response. Let me try and dissect that a little bit, though, right? So what I'm hearing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is there's a role for the public sector to signal, to secure. There's a role for the private sector to come in after the securitization is done or some risk is apportioned. And there's also sort of, in order to meet the demand, you cannot do without one or the other. It really needs to be more of a focused effort around private sector mobilization in the future than it has been in the past, where public sector has taken a larger role. Is that a fair restatement of the intent?
I think in the infrastructure space, that's a very fair way to say it. I mean, Anoop mentioned this before in the introductory comments, and it's more of a punchline, less specifically about hydropower, but infrastructure. But Nepal will likely go through the process, we hope, that India went through, in which the private sector went from being a profit-seeking bad thing to one that is seen as more of a partner and one that is going to be a driver of the growth. I think that in the Nepali zeitgeist, if you like, in the Nepali, especially on social media, there still remains a quite antiquated view that the private sector and profit is a bad thing and a dirty word. And I think finding a way to get the balance right between regulating, managing, and controlling the private sector, which is absolutely necessary, but seeing them as a real partner in the future and growth of the country is in some ways a foundational challenge of the country.
Thank you, David. So I'm going to go towards the last segment of our conversation, and it's going to leave a little bit more time to engage with the audience. Very honest assessment, okay? Nepal has been at inflection points before. We've all lived through them. Many of us in this room have lived through them. What are 2 or 3 concrete, observable signals that you would tell us within the next 12 to 18 months whether this moment is genuinely different? What are the things that you would look at to signal the genuine intent through your sort of World Bank Group lens?
Look, I think that if our North Star is 7% growth and jobs, let me give you 3 ideas that are all of different levels of sort of granularity. And all of which I've mentioned already. But the first is I think if you start seeing some serious foreign direct investment, that would be the greatest signal that the policy reform agenda and the governance approach that the new administration has taken is bearing fruit. So when I think about all of the different macro, and we have a million macro indicators we could talk about, all kinds of things. I think if I'm going to pick one, it's going to be to see some foreign direct investment in the country, and probably also to see some domestic investment, to see that those $2 million per hour of remittances that are coming to the country. So in the time that I've been speaking here, it's been 30 minutes, there's been $1 million of remittances that have hit the country. Seeing some of that translate into domestic investment too. But if I'm going to pick one metric, it's going to be foreign direct investment. I think on the sectoral reform agenda, to pick one, I think that if this government can be serious about civil aviation reform, I don't see a way for Nepal to realize its aspirations in the tourism space without being super serious about civil aviation reform. It is long overdue. It is not rocket science. And all indications are that there's a really real willingness to tackle this. So that's a specific sector reform agenda that I think. And then just finally, to repeat what I said before in my last answer, I think that when I spend a lot of time on Nepali social media, always translated into English, so I get about 70% of things. But I think when we start seeing the tenor of the discussion be less about the private sector being a problem and more about the private sector being part of the solution for the jobs and growth agenda. I think when those three things happen, that would give someone like me a lot of confidence that my hopes and my own aspirations for Nepal are starting to be realized. So,
Thank you, David. And before we open up for questions, I want to add one more sort of, not tangential, but related topic that maybe you can say something about. What about the investment in human capital, right? How do you see that on this priority stack? What sort of interventions or what sort of prescriptions would you just care to discuss to make sure that Nepal doesn't miss out on the next sort of evolution of our workforce?
Well, again, let's start with the positive news, because there's a glimmer of positive news there, which is that, in the education space, access to primary education is now today effectively universal. Basically, Nepal has done something tremendous over the last 2 decades, which is that it's got kids into school, okay? That number falls pretty quickly when you look at secondary education. But for early childhood education, primary education, Nepal has made incredible leaps forward. But the quality of education in the public sector is frankly a crisis, okay? When we look at the official numbers of learning poverty, they're around 70%. And that includes the private schools. And everyone in this room knows that the remittances that are flowing into the country, it's now been 40 minutes, so it's more than 500,000. It's, $620,000 have come, or $1.3 million have come, are buying kids into private schools. And that has been the escape route from a dysfunctional public school system. So I think, number one, before we start talking about TVET and training kids in cybersecurity and how to be AI engineers, Nepal must solve its foundational education challenge. It is an absolute crisis. I really think that if I were the person thinking about these things or running it, that is really where I would put my hopes, dreams, and energy into addressing the foundational learning challenges, because all the work that I think you're pointing to around the education of the future, higher education, it really all does flow from that.
Thank you, David. So I think that concludes the sort of you and me one-on-one segment of our conversation. I'd like to now open up to the audience. I keep looking at my phone because I'm told I'll be receiving questions on my WhatsApp, but if not, maybe there's some mechanism to take questions from the audience for you.
Great, the scary part. Yes, great.
Gentleman over there.
We have some QR codes, if you'll notice, on the table. We want to go digital a little bit, so if you could just scan the QR code that's on your table. If you have any questions, you can use that medium. You can give your name, your question, and then our moderator will be receiving those questions on the phone. So यहाँहरुका केही प्रश्नहरु छन् भने डिजिटली टेबलमा रहेको क्यूआर स्क्यान गरेर यहाँले आफ्नो प्रश्नहरु राख्न सक्ने जानकारी म गराउन चाहन्छु. And the same will go on for both the sessions that will follow in just a little while. So हाम्रो session 1 र session 2 मा हाम्रा मोडरेटरले पनि हाम्रा प्यानलिस्टहरुका लागि प्रश्न यही माध्यमबाट लिने जानकारी पनि म गराउन चाहन्छु.
I've received one, so while I wait for additional questions, this is a tricky one, David, so here we go. So given Nepal's history of strong reform signals followed by weak implementation, what's the World Bank actually doing differently this time to support and translate the intended sort of theory into practice on the ground?
I think it's the best, it is, frankly, in Nepal, the most important question. Because policy reforms are relatively easy to do, and getting results out of them are really complicated. And there's something special in Nepal that makes things somehow more difficult to get done. And, you know, I don't have a full answer to it. What I can say is that we are, number one, we're reducing the in our own small world, and we finance about 15 to 20% of the capital budget of the country. Which is really a remarkably large number. When you add us and the ADB together, we're 35% of the capital budget of the country. So my small world is not so small in Nepal. But one of the things that we're doing, for example, is reducing the complexity of some of the things that we're working on. I'll give you a concrete example. We are trying to, we are supporting the government in trying to tackle, as I mentioned, this crisis issue of air quality in the Kathmandu Valley, right? I know that the popular mythology is that the pollution comes from the neighbors, but actually 85% of the pollution in the valley comes from within the valley. So we've tried, rather than, as a concrete example, trying to deal with this problem in its multitude of complex ways, we've taken one bite of the apple as a first step, which is to try to get rid of the 1,000 industrial boilers that are the largest contributor. Interestingly, 1,000 industrial boilers are the largest contributor to air quality, to pollution in the valley. The second is diesel buses, right? But so take one bite at the apple at a time. So there's one concrete example. We're saying solving complex problems is too difficult in Nepal. We're going to try to make things a little simpler, even if it takes a little bit more time.
Thanks, David. So I've got two questions here. I'm going to try and club these together because I think it makes better sense that way. The question is really, if you had to take a pick, and you've spoken to this a little bit already, in terms of sectors, high growth sectors, how would you pick the highest priority sector available from hydropower, tourism, digital economy, et cetera? I'm going to make this even easier. If it was digital economy, what are the sectoral reforms on the enabling environment front that you would try and speak to move that agenda forward faster?
Okay, let me give two answers to that. So on the latter, and these are not comprehensive answers, but just some thoughts. So on the latter, I think, and with my apologies because I mentioned this, but I think in the digital space, it is a combination of two things. The foundational reforms that we talked about that are cross-cutting across sectors, making this place a better place to invest in. Taxes, repatriation of profits, predictability of bureaucracy, political stability, frankly. It's really striking that when we did this multi-country enterprise survey, 41%, this is just from a couple years ago, 41% of the private sector responded that the greatest inhibitor to investing in Nepal was policy instability. That's an outlier compared to any other country in the region. So policy stability. So the foundational issues that I think we're working on with the administration right now. And the second are some of the sector-specific ones, like the ones I mentioned. So in the digital space, I think the data protection law, which doesn't exist right now, is absolutely critical. I would prioritize it. Let me also mention one other thing that I neglected to mention, which is that Nepal is currently on the FATF gray list. And they are coming in, I think, just a few months to do an assessment. And getting off that gray list and, God forbid, avoiding getting put on the blacklist, I think needs to be among the highest priorities for policymakers, because that would increase the cost of doing business so much for the private sector. So I think that's one. Let me just make a final pitch on this city that we live in, because it's not, and this is not with any bias towards any other part of the country, but I think that when we think about Nepal, we do not see any path to 7% growth that does not go through Kathmandu Valley. It's frankly, if we are talking about a services economy, it's frankly where a bulk of the jobs are going to be created. So making the investments today for the primate city of the future is, I think, absolutely critical. So getting the dysfunctional, and I say that with much love, but I ride a motorcycle every day in this city, so I know what the dysfunctional public transportation system is like. Getting the bus system fixed, getting oxygen, back in the Bagmati River system, reducing the water stress. 40 liters per capita per day is the consumption of water in the valley. This is like less than a third of what we would consider to be the minimum of 100, the sort of standard minimum. And making this a place where both Nepalis want to invest, but as we've seen some effort to bring digital nomads and these kinds of things, but where really people with the jobs of the future want to invest and live in. So if I had my druthers, to answer your question, I could make one bet on one thing that would get us to 7% growth. It is making this city a more competitive and livable place for investors and the private sector.
Thanks, David. So we've got a little bit of a tricky question now. It's a softball, but it's completely, there's no magic formula to this. Gentleman, Mr. Vivek in the audience wants to know, you talked about the view in which the private sector is sort of held and the need to change that perspective. It's more of a cultural mind shift, if you will. He wants to know, what would you prescribe to enable that transition faster?
This is a tricky question, but I think that the colleagues here who know the southern neighbor, India, well, will tell you that is exactly the transition that happened from the 1990s. And I think that some of the efforts that have been in place around governance, around making sure that the reputation of the private sector is impeccable in terms of not doing the wrong things. When we were together in Harvard and the CEO of Encel was there, he talked very directly and openly about the sins of the fathers. So people who had done the wrong things from the private sector that irrevocably taint the reputation moving forward. So, it takes two to tango. When we talk about corruption, it takes two to tango. It takes someone on the public side and someone on the private side. So this is the great challenge that Nepal faces, I think, right now, which is that the private sector as a whole is being painted with the same brush. And if I were a private investor, if I was running a private sector company, making sure that issue around governance and good governance and clean ways of doing business would be my greatest differentiator in terms of my competitive approach, right?
Thank you very much, David. Look, I think we just made history here by actually concluding our segment 5 minutes in advance. It's very rare in our market. So round of applause, please, for David Sislen.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our moderator and to Mr. Sislen as well for grounding us in data that we can't ignore and for reminding us that behind every statistic lies a challenge. And if we get it right, there lies an opportunity as well. This fireside chat, I believe, definitely gave us the reality check, the roadmap, and the very gentle economic jolt that we also needed today. Now, moving forward, we have our first panel discussion, and the topic is driving private sector growth, policy, partnership, progress. The private sector, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, in many ways is like the heartbeat of the economic activity, as discussed in the fireside chat as well. It's a space where ideas turns into enterprises, where risks will turn into rewards, and where innovation definitely stops being a buzzword and becomes many people's Monday morning meetings.